In 1865, the United States ended the bloodiest war in American history. There were about 750,000 Americans killed during this war. It is the first war in which we had photography, so we actually got to see what war was like. It's kind of interesting. When I started graduate school, the number of dead was like 600,000, and for a long time it was 400,000, and now it's up to 750,000. And just so you know, it's true in every single major war and every single pandemic. When the numbers get over 400, 500,000, we somehow lose track of hundreds of thousands of millions of people. World War II, we'll get to that. We somehow lose track of millions and millions of people dead. But that's true in every single war and pandemic. So the coronavirus, the number dead you see now is low. It will go higher. The South had surrendered, but it's not because they didn't want to fight. It was because they were blood dry. Their population was so much smaller that they just couldn't keep going. But they didn't have remorse, and they stopped because they had been absolutely decimated. The South was destroyed. It was not all of it, but several of the major cities were burnt to the ground and just bombarded, especially because of Grant and Sherman and their strategy in the South. The whole thing was just catastrophic, and I have a very hard time when people praise the Civil War as being great. And just so you know, I'm half Korean, half white, and on the white side, I have ancestors that fought for the Confederacy. I just find it bizarre that people hold it up as some great thing. This is a Union soldier from one of the worst camps, Confederate camps, called Andersonville. Just so you know, fun fact, and this will be a question on your quiz, there is only one Confederate that was ever executed for war crimes for the Civil War. There's only one officer from the Confederacy that was ever executed by the North, and his name was Henry Wirz, and he was the commanding officer at Andersonville. And he went on record as saying, "I'm killing more people at Andersonville than Lee is in the field." So that is why he was executed for war atrocities. Now, the Civil War definitively disproved two things. First, states cannot secede from the Union. And I know in Texas that's blasphemy, but that is, I could do a whole other talk about secession and why secession is not allowed, not just for political and legal reasons, but for economic reasons, especially economic reasons. But Civil War determined states cannot secede from the Union. The country is a nation. It is a pact. And the second thing the Civil War did is get rid of slavery in the United States. That wasn't why Lincoln started, that's not why Lincoln fought the Civil War. If he could have stopped the Civil War from happening and not freed any slaves, he would have definitely done that. Lincoln's objective was to preserve the Union, but in doing so, freeing all the slaves led to that end faster. So he committed to freeing the slaves, and so a civil war will lead to the end of slavery. Now, when the war ended, though, there were three major questions. And these are the three questions that will have to be decided during Reconstruction. First, what to do about the Confederate officers and the leaders. All of them had sworn allegiance to the United States. They had sworn on a Bible to protect the United States Constitution, and they had all engaged in legally what is called treason. They had tried to destroy the United States. Do not come at me with, no, it was states' rights and they believed in blah, 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 blah. Their objective is to create a union, but that will destroy the United States. So they are trying to destroy the United States. And that is treason. What do we do with, what do most countries do with people that engage in treason? They execute them. That is the normal punishment for treason. So what do we do about them? Second question, what do we do about those states? It may sound easy, just bring the states back into the Union, but it is an insanely difficult question, and that would be one of the main questions in Reconstruction. How do we bring the southern states back into the Union? Because that is the ultimate objective. To preserve the Union, all the states have to be brought back in. So they have to be brought back in. It's just, how is that going to happen? And the third question, what do we do about those 4 million former slaves? It's about 4 million blacks who were slaves, less than less than 10% of them could read, because most southern states had laws against even teaching them to read. So what do we do about them? Should they be given something to help them get started? Should they be just told, you're on your own, good luck? Remember, they don't have any education, they don't have any background, they have nothing. So what to do about the former slaves? During Reconstruction, during this period, there are 4 general phases. The first is presidential Reconstruction. It is when the presidents will try to say what happens during this period. Started by Lincoln and then followed by his successor, Andrew Johnson. Under Johnson, he will do such a bad job, according to most Northerners and most Republicans, that Congress will take power away from the president. And then we begin what's called Congressional Reconstruction. Presidential and Congressional Reconstruction, that is looking at Reconstruction at the federal level, what's happening at the national level. Once Congressional Reconstruction starts, then we look at what's happening at the state level. And at the state level, there's 2 phases we will look at. Republican state governments in the South, and that is when the South, remember it's solidly Democratic, it is controlled by Republicans. So what happens during that period in the South when the state governments in the South are controlled by Republicans from the North? And then the 4th phase, redemption, when Southern whites regain control. Southern white Democrats regain control of the South. So those are the 4 general phases of Reconstruction. Now, everyone agrees Reconstruction was a failure. Southerners talk about it like it's the worst thing that ever happened, most corrupt governments, and they hate it. Northerners agree that Reconstruction was a complete failure because, from their perspective, it was a failure, and it was obviously a failure for blacks. It will be a really big failure for the newly freed slaves. Now, this point is important. This will be a question on your quiz. The reason it's a failure is because what Reconstruction fundamentally is the United States engaged in what's called nation building. So we teach the Civil War and Reconstruction like they're 2 totally different things. The fact that we teach the Civil War in the first half and Reconstruction in the second half is kind of crazy, since That would be like separating the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq, like they're two totally separate wars, and they're not. They're different phases of the same war. Reconstruction is the North trying to remake the South, reconstruct the South to be in the North's image. They'll try to do that by changing it politically, economically, socially, culturally. They are trying to change the South. They are trying to engage in nation building. It is the same thing that the U.S. tried in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Vietnam. It's the same thing the British tried during the American Revolution. It's the same thing the Soviets tried during their invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. If you took my first half of this class, you'll remember there's a term for it. It's called a counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgencies have so many examples of failing. Every one of those things I just mentioned are an example of it. Trying to force people to have a government that they don't want and doesn't represent them does not go well. So, Reconstruction, everyone agrees, was a failure. That's why it's not fun to... I don't particularly enjoy talking about it, but it is so important to understand. So, starting with presidential Reconstruction. Abraham Lincoln insisted that Reconstruction was part of war, and presidents are responsible for war, so he was in charge of Reconstruction. Look at the presidency, it always ages people. If you see pictures of them before they come into office and then after they leave office, they always look just a million years older. And Lincoln is definitely no exception. Now, Lincoln, how did he feel about Reconstruction? What did he want to do? Did he want to punish the South? Or was he wanting to be lenient? And the answer is insanely lenient. Because again, Lincoln did not fight the Civil War because he wanted to free slaves. He fought it to preserve the Union. So his goal is to bring the Union back together as fast as he possibly can. And in order to do that, he was insanely lenient. He will call for a policy called the 10% plan. Lincoln's 10% plan is about as easy of a Reconstruction method as you can imagine. When a number of men in the state equal to 10% of the number who voted in 1860 took the oath of loyalty, then they could have constitutional convention, write a new constitution, elect new officials, and create a new government. 10%, that is insanely low. So this is about as easy of a Reconstruction policy as you can get. Southerners love this. Southern whites, I should say, love this. In general, any one of these phases that Southern whites like, freedmen, newly freed blacks, they will not like. This said nothing about blacks. This was going to leave the freedmen to the mercy of Southern state governments. Lincoln proposed this, and it immediately ran into opposition. There were a lot of people in the North, a lot of Republicans, Lincoln's own party, that did not like this, especially in Congress, especially a group that were called the Radical Republicans. These are Republicans that partly they wanted protection from blacks, but especially, and this is true for a lot of Northerners, they did not want Southerners to get off that easily. Southerners had just started the Civil War, and it had been a very bloody war, and a lot of Northerners, not just radicals, wanted the South to pay. Two of the leaders of the Radical Republicans, one was a senator named Charles Sumner. If you remember from the first half of U.S. history, Charles Sumner was almost beaten to death by a guy named Preston Brooks of South Carolina on the floor of the Senate. He was beaten nearly to death, and he wants revenge, understandably. Another was in the House of Representatives, a guy named Thaddeus Stevens. So they proposed the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill was going to make it would make it much more difficult, to put it mildly. So there was going to be a confrontation between Lincoln and his own party. And we will never know exactly how that would have gone. It's the last picture of Lincoln when he was alive. So fascinating. You can actually see how sad he was. Lincoln was chronically depressed, and he was an insanely gentle, sensitive person. He didn't even like to hunt. I think he killed a turkey once, and that was like the biggest animal he killed. But the Civil War, it weighed on him. This was taken April 10th. 4 days later, at Ford's Theater, he will be killed by John Wilkes Booth. So we will never know what would have happened, but his successor, Andrew Johnson, was the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner, and he was a Democrat in every way, shape, or form. He was an all-out supporter of Andrew Jackson. The only reason he was put on the ticket is because he was one of two governors in the South that had opposed secession. And the other one was Sam Houston, who was great. But Andrew Johnson, he opposed secession because he hated rich people. And he said the whole secession movement was by a bunch of rich slave-owning planters, and so that's why he opposed it. But he was not like, he was a perennial drunk and incredibly racist, and just, again, like a lot of people back then, they were openly racist. He said this after he became president. This is a country for white men, and by God, while I'm president, it shall remain a country for white men. So he obviously was going to make Reconstruction very lenient and not going to do anything for the freedmen. So he will continue Lincoln's when he became president. Congress wasn't in session, so he had 7 months to do everything as fast as he could, and he worked as fast as he could. And his Reconstruction policy was the same as Lincoln's, the 10% plan, but he added in one addendum. Anyone that was worth anything over $20,000 had to go to him personally in order to be pardoned. So basically, he wanted rich people to come and worship him. He was a very petty person. So, as you would guess, under Andrew Johnson, all the southern states, they reconstructed as fast as they possibly could. And they all went through the process of Reconstruction as quick as they could so they could come back into the Union and keep their governments as similar to what they had been before Reconstruction as they were after. So you don't have to memorize this, but again, the process of bringing states back in, it was very complicated. And during Reconstruction, here are the phases. They have to register voters. The voters have to elect a constitutional convention. They have to write a constitution. They were supposed to ratify the 13th Amendment. They were supposed to elect state government, state legislature or governor. Then they were supposed to elect representatives to the U.S. House and U.S. Senate. And then they would be brought back into the Union. And so under presidential Reconstruction, all the southern states reconstructed as fast as they could. And as you would guess, they created governments almost identical to what they had before, as close as they could. And they made it very clear that they had absolutely no remorse. So when Congress came back into session, when the U.S. Congress came back into session, Northerners and Republicans were pissed. The Southerners made it clear they had no remorse. 3 big ways. First, 13th Amendment, that outlawed slavery. A lot of them just didn't ratify it. They refused to. So that is the first way. They made it clear that they did not feel any remorse. And yeah, make sure you know these 3 ways they felt no remorse. First, they didn't ratify the 13th Amendment. 2 fun facts about this. 1, Mississippi was the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment. Mississippi ratified it in 1995. You don't want to rush those things, I guess. Second interesting fact about the 13th Amendment. Everyone knows it prohibits slavery, except read it very closely. There is one exception. Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. If you remember from my first lecture, the United States, which is about 4% of the U.S. population, has in it about 22% of all incarcerated people in the world. Why do we have so many people in jail in the United States? It's because of the 13th Amendment. Every nation in the world has some sort of underclass that they keep an underclass so they can have a cheap labor source. That is fairly universal. It's not true everywhere, but almost every country has it. And in the United States, it has always been African Americans. You want to know why we have so many people in jail right now? That's why. If you want to know more about this, there's a documentary on Netflix called 13th, and you can see it. That's why incarcerated labor, they get paid 20 cents an hour, and they make stuff for Victoria's Secret, Lockheed Martin. All these major companies use the labor of people in jail. That is why the United States has so many more prisoners than everywhere else. So, first way Southerners made it very clear they did not feel bad about the Civil War's 13th Amendment. That pissed off a lot of Northerners. Second way, black codes. Do not get these mistaken for Jim Crow. They're not the same thing. Black codes are specifically passed in southern United States during presidential Reconstruction. They will go away. The Jim Crow, that is like 1880s and 1890s, so it is decades later. 2 totally different things. Black codes were laws passed by southern states during presidential Reconstruction that said specifically what blacks can and cannot do. And it varied by state, but it'd be stuff like blacks can't they can't own property, they can't serve on juries, they can't testify against whites, they can't own guns, they can't go to school. And one very popular one is they have to have a work contract. And if they don't have a work contract, they go to jail. Once they're in jail, they have to pay for staying in jail. And since they can't afford it, since they don't have any money, since they were slaves, they are rented out to local plantations where they can work off their debt, which sounds like slavery because it's another way to have slaves. So they passed black codes. Every southern state had them. And this pissed off Northerners. And finally, and this really pissed off Northerners, they sent back people to Congress and the Senate, or to the House and the Senate, that were obviously made it clear that they had no remorse for anything about the Civil War. One of the people they sent back, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, he is the vice president for the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis was the president. Alexander Hamilton Stevens is the vice president. It looks like a skeleton in a suit. He is living in that picture, I promise you. Another person sent back by Texas, Orrin M. Roberts. He looks like Santa Claus, but he is not Santa Claus. He was a leader in Texas seceding from the Union. He was a general and a leader during the Civil War, and he is also the person that will head Texas's constitutional convention to rewrite a constitution. And he said this very openly. The point of creating the Constitution of during presidential Reconstruction was to preserve a white man's government and keep Sambo from the polls. He said that blatantly and openly. So Northerners were furious. When Congress came back into session, now, to this day, in the Constitution, Congress has the right to judge its own members. So Congress can reject people from Congress if Congress agrees, and so they would not seat people like Warren Roberts and Alexander Hamilton Stevens. When Congress came back into session, they will take Reconstruction into their own hands. So the very first thing they do is create a joint committee on Reconstruction to investigate Reconstruction and see what's going on. And that's when they find out about the Black Codes. That's when they find out about how much Southerners make it clear that they have no remorse. Congress will then pass the Freedmen's Bureau. This is the very first, what we would call a welfare agency in American history. It is an agency to help the freed blacks. And it did all sorts of things. One of the biggest ones, provide education. It also helped them with work contracts, because they would sign, the freedmen would sign work contracts with, say, plantation owners. And then if plantation owners said, well, I'm not going to pay you, or just refuse to, there's nothing the freedmen could do. Because it's not like they could go to a local judge. The local judge was probably a planter himself. And there was no police force or anything like that they could go to. So Freedmen's Bureau did that too. One of the biggest things the Freedmen's Bureau did, though, was help freedmen find family members. So former slaves would go to the freedmen and say, I had a wife and 2 kids. I was sold in Mississippi from this plantation. I need to find them. Parents were frequently sold away from their kids, husbands from their wives, and so they would go to the Freedmen's Bureau to help find their family. When this was passed, Johnson vetoed it. He said the southern states will take care of the freedmen. Congress also passed the Civil Rights Act. It would give blacks some rights, guarantee them some rights. Congress also vetoed this one. When Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act, Republicans in Congress, both radical Republicans and non-radical Republicans, moderate Republicans, were so mad that they vetoed Andrew Johnson. They vetoed Johnson's veto. They overrode Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act, and then overrode his veto of the Freedmen's Bureau and passed that. So now it's very clear Congress is pissed, and they have more power than Johnson. This was the same year as congressional elections were taking place. In 1866, congressional elections were taking place, so 1/3 of the Senate and all of the House of Representatives were up for re-election. And it was an election basically between Andrew Johnson and Congress. Now, Johnson did something no president had ever done. He traveled throughout the country to try to gain support for himself and try to get Northerners to vote against Republicans and support people who would support his Reconstruction policy. And as you would guess, he was wildly unpopular. At one stop, he was speaking and someone yelled out, "Hang Jefferson Davis," and he said, "No, we should hang Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. They're the real enemies," which most Northerners didn't agree with. He also was constantly drunk. At one point, he compared himself to Jesus. One of his aides actually said to him, "Sir, your dignity." And he yelled, "What do I care about my dignity?" And he said that in front of journalists. And that was printed all throughout the country. Well, as a result of the congressional elections of 1866, Republicans opposed to Johnson and that wanted to punish the South swept Congress. So now Congress is completely controlled by people who are against Johnson. This is the end of presidential Reconstruction and the beginning of congressional Reconstruction. So now Congress has control, and the very first thing they do, one of the first things they do, and this is just kind of a side note, is try to impeach Johnson. So they set up a committee to impeach the president, and I'm not going to go into the whole backstory of how they did it. They basically set Johnson up with a 10-year of office act, saying he couldn't fire any of his cabinet members, and because they knew he was going to, and when he did, then they set up a committee to impeach him. And now you guys are all experts about impeachment because you've lived through 2 of the 4 impeachments in U.S. history. Just so you know, and there is a question on the quiz about this. Impeachment happens in the House of Representatives. A lot of people think that when a president is impeached, they're removed from office. But again, you all know this is not the case because you've lived through 2 of the 4 impeachments in U.S. history. Impeachment happens in the House, and then it goes into the Senate, where the Senate votes on whether to remove the president. So we've had 4 impeachments in U.S. history. Andrew Johnson is the very first one, Bill Clinton, and then Donald Trump twice. A lot of people also think Richard Nixon was impeached, but he wasn't. Nixon was going to be impeached, and he was going to be convicted and removed in the Senate, and so he resigned before any of that could happen. So Charles Sumner said it very clearly. Impeachment is a political proceeding before a political body with a political purpose. And this is one of the funny things about impeachments is in the 3 I've been alive for, people say, well, yeah, but this is just all politics. Of course it's politics. That is not actually news to anyone. Shouldn't be news to anyone. It's meant to be a political process. That's why it's in Congress. Congress is a political body. If it was specifically a legal issue, it would be in the Supreme Court. But it was never meant to be just a legal issue. It is a political issue, and that is supposed to represent the political beliefs of the country. That is why it is in Congress. So when someone says, well, it's politics, yes it is. That's not news. No one should say that like they've discovered something, because it's meant to be political. And boy, was it. People were so bored back then that they actually sold tickets. This is like, this is like the Super Bowl basically back then. People were so excited. Johnson was impeached, but he was not convicted. They got 1 vote short of conviction. And it was probably the right thing. It's easy to criticize Johnson, and it was terrible in all sorts of ways, but it would have set a bad precedence, probably, for them to impeach him on the grounds that they did. But it didn't matter anyway, because Congress already had enough control they could override anything he did, and 1868 was an election year, so they just had to wait 2 years. Of course, Andrew Johnson was not going to be renominated by Republicans, and he definitely wasn't going to be renominated by Democrats. So Republicans chose a president that they thought they could control, Ulysses S. Grant. So they picked someone that would step out of the way and not try to interfere. And Grant, of course, will win overwhelmingly. And when Grant wins, Reconstruction starts all over. Under Congressional Reconstruction. During Congressional Reconstruction, Reconstruction starts all over with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The first thing they do is they get rid of all those governments that were created during presidential Reconstruction. So that's why the black codes, they're all gone. All those are gone. Then, the second thing they did was divide the South into five military districts. So now the South has 5 military districts, and each one of these is overseen by a military general. That's why Reconstruction is the military occupation of the South by the North. This is overseen by the military. So now a military general will oversee voting, will oversee giving the vote back to the population, oversee the elections, oversee the Constitutional Convention, oversee the writing of the new Constitution. So the North is in military control of all of this. And this is the process of Reconstruction. You register all eligible voters, white and black, write a new constitution, or call a constitutional convention, let eligible voters vote for who will go to the constitutional convention. They will write a new constitution, hold elections. They have to now adopt the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment had already been adopted. They'll have to adopt the 14th Amendment, and then they will elect people, new congressmen. The 14th Amendment is the amendment that says everyone born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. And this is meant to give ex-slaves rights of citizens. 14th Amendment, it is an absolutely essential amendment. And also, if you were paying attention to the news, it is what is in the news a lot now. Because one of the key provisions of the 14th Amendment is the reason Colorado and Maine right now say Donald Trump cannot be on the ballot. I am not saying anything pro or against in any way, shape, or form, but this is what the decisions in those states were based on. Disbarred from holding office anyone who has sworn an oath to the United States and then broke that oath. This was aimed at ex-Confederates, but the way it was worded, it was intended to not just apply to ex-Confederates. It was applied to anyone that has held office in the United States, sworn an oath to protect the U.S. Constitution, and then broke that oath by doing something that could be considered treasonous. So, 14th Amendment, it is in the news all over the place now. As the southern states started reconstructing under congressional Reconstruction, Northerners saw that blacks having the right to vote was a good thing. So they will then call for the ratification of the 15th Amendment, and this is the right to vote. This is really important. You need to know this. There are 3 amendments that are called the Reconstruction Amendments. So the first 10 amendments in the U.S. are called the Bill of Rights. And we have 3 amendments that are the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment prohibits slavery, 14th Amendment citizenship, and 15th Amendment the right to vote. There is an inherent problem in our 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. By the way, this is the entire 15th Amendment. This is all of it in its totality, these 2 sections. What is the flaw there? When you specify who can vote, anyone that's not included, it means they can't vote. It does not say anything about women. That is why we will have to have another amendment so women can vote later. So it does not include women at all. So the 14th and 15th Amendments will be adopted. And this is when we go to Republican state governments in the South. Southern states, all attention then went to Southern states, and what was happening in the South was revolutionary. The Republican state governments in the South now is when the South is controlled by Republicans. And remember, the South is solidly Democratic. So these are imposed governments. They do not represent the population, and they are imposed by the military. There are 3 groups that make up the Republican leadership and support. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. Carpetbaggers are anyone that comes from the north down to the south. Now, they're called carpetbaggers because Southerners said they came back with a carpet bag, which is like a big duffel bag made out of carpet, to steal everything they could. That's what the picture is. The some from the north with the bags stealing all the southern stuff, being propped up by Union American soldiers on the back of the South. Now, all carpetbaggers were not trying to steal. There were a lot of them that were like teachers. There were several that were, missionaries. Carpetbaggers is just anyone that came from the north to the south. And the idea that they were all stealing is not correct. There were some that stole. We'll get to this. That wasn't a Republican thing. That wasn't a Northern thing. That was all over the place. Scalawags, those are Southerners that that supported the Republicans or were Republicans, and they were seen as traitors. So they were really hated. And of course, the freedmen. Freedmen were given the right to vote, and as you would guess, they overwhelmingly voted Republican. So they mostly provided the vote, but some of them actually were in leadership roles. For example, the very first black senator in U.S. history, Hiram Revels. He's from Mississippi, and he, irony of ironies, from Mississippi, he is filling the seat that was held before by Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So the first black senator we have filled the seat of the only president of the Confederacy. And another black senator from Mississippi also, Blanche Bruce. So mostly blacks provided the vote, but they also, some held key leadership positions. Now, as you would there is a general, if you ask most Southerners, to this day, they will say the Republican governments were all corrupt. And that's all they were, was corrupt. And that is not true. They did three major things. First, education. They created an education system in the South. A lot of places in the North had developed education systems. South had not. So one of the big things they did was tried to create educational systems for the region. And this, of course, they were going to educate whites, but they were also going to educate the freedmen. It was a way to help freedmen advance. Second thing that they did was military and police. Southerners had never really had police forces. They had slave patrols, which is people, got together and they'd have their turn to patrol and find runaway slaves. But in general, in the South, they had vigilante justice type thing. So they did not pay for police forces in most places because they didn't want to and they didn't want taxes. And they will also create militaries in the South because Republican governments, they needed militaries. So those are the three big things they did. Obviously, all three of those require taxes. So they will raise taxes in the South. And taxes get raised all throughout the South. Southerners, of course, hated this. And they hated this for all sorts of reasons. For one, as I just mentioned, the taxes. The South had always been against taxes. They always had very low to almost no taxes because they didn't have any of those things. Education, police. The third thing that Republican governments did. So it's education, police and military. Third thing, roads, railroads, and industry. They tried to build up the South economically to make it look like the North. So, and the data on this is they actually built a lot of railroads, a lot of roads, a lot of industry, things that are just good that you'd want in the South. The Southerners would want. Southerners hated all of this. And they hated it for good reasons. Again, first, taxes. People that had absolutely no taxes or very little taxes before all of a sudden had taxes. The number I've read is that on average taxes raise like 400% throughout the South. Now, 400% is a ton, but in one sense, when you're starting from almost nothing, it's not that much. But in fairness to Southerners, you're talking about people that their economies had been destroyed anyway. A lot of them had lost tons of wealth. So you're putting taxes, no matter how little, on people that were struggling already anyway. So taxes was a big one. Centralized power. Obviously, the military had control of these 5 military districts. Then there would be military leaders in every one of the states. And so they centralized control in the capital at all the states. Southerners had always liked a decentralized system, or had always called for a decentralized system, so that was another one. Third big reason was corruption. And to this day, you will hear people say that these governments were all corrupt. There was some corruption, but to say they were all corrupt is just factually incorrect. And there are plenty of books and a lot of evidence on this. There definitely was corruption, but corruption at this time was kind of ubiquitous. And not just the Republican governments in the South, it was ubiquitous in the North, it was ubiquitous at the national level. It was just, corruption was the norm. We'll talk about this when we talk about the Gilded Age. But corruption in government was the norm. And the most corrupt governments we had in the country at this time were Democrats in the North, in the cities, like Tammany Hall in New York. And so it wasn't a Republican thing. It wasn't a Southern thing. It was just corruption everywhere. Obviously, though, if you lived in the South and you were a Democrat and you hated these governments, every example of corruption just was amplified. So there was some corruption. It was absolutely not more than among Republicans than it was with Democrats, and it wasn't more in the South than it was in the North. A fourth reason was blacks, and this is very understandable. For a population that had given blacks absolutely no rights whatsoever, for them all of a sudden have the right to vote, didn't sit well. But the most important reason, and this one everyone should be able to understand very well, is that these are imposed governments. Southerners didn't vote for these. These are governments that are forced on them. No one wants that. If you remember, if you took the first half of this with me, that is the reason for the American Revolution. The power to govern is such an important power, and the majority of Southerners do not want Republican governments. And regardless of any of the other reasons, just because they're imposed, just because these are governments that are forced on Southerners. So Southerners, they will fight back, of course. And this is the first period of major white supremacist movement and the beginning of the KKK. Now, there were all sorts of different versions of this, but the KKK is obviously the most famous. And keep this in mind because we'll talk about the KKK later in the 1920s. But this KKK, they just wrote at night because they had to be secretive, because obviously there were now police and military, and they had a very specific political objective, and that was to scare Republicans and blacks from voting. So that is what they're trying to do. They're threatening Republicans and blacks to make sure that they don't vote. This is something that they actually, threatening letter that they actually left the Ohio carpetbagger, KKK donkey. So this is the rise of the KKK. Grant and the United States Congress will pass laws, and Grant will use the military to put this down. But here's the kicker. Southerners really didn't have to do this. It was only a matter of time before they would get control back by just doing one simple thing: voting. There will be weakening support for Reconstruction in the North. And this was shown in all sorts of ways. In 1872, they ended the Freedmen's Bureau. It was, said, well, now that Republicans control the South, we don't need a Freedmen's Bureau. So there will be the end of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1872, and also that year there will be a General Amnesty Act, which means they give the right to vote to most Southern whites. When this happens, that is the end of Republican state governments in the South. All Southern Democrats now have to do is wait till the next election and vote. So why was there weakening support in the North? And this is important, and make sure you know this. For one, it's political. The leaders who had supported Reconstruction and more harsh Reconstruction policy in the South, the leaders that had supported that, like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, they were dying off, or they were losing political power, losing office. So that was a big thing, is the political will. The political leaders were all going away. Second, corruption. And I don't mean corruption by Republican state governments in the South. I mean corruption at the national level. The Grant administration was the most corrupt government we had up to that point. We will have more corrupt governments in the future, but that is the most corrupt government. It was so corrupt that the Republican Party will actually split. And there will be a group called the Liberal Republicans that want to reform the government to make it less corrupt, but that level of corruption made it so a lot of Northerners, they didn't care about the South. They wanted to clean up the North. Third reason was economic. In 1873, the United States experienced the worst economic collapse in U.S. history. And as soon as the economy collapsed and people started being hurt in the North, they don't care about the South anymore. There's one thing about economic collapses is people stop caring about a lot of things that don't affect them, because all of a sudden they're worried about how to live. So in the North, they stopped caring. So you had political, you had corruption, you had economic, and the fourth reason, and arguably the most important reason, exhaustion. The Civil War started in 1861, and back then, people believed, or it was generally believed, you have to pay for wars. Just so you know, ever since about 2000, the United States has started to believe that we can lower taxes while going to war, and that is something that you cannot do. War always means higher taxes. Always means higher taxes. And the United States had been at war for 12 years now. Civil War up to 1870s. Well, by 1875, 1876, 15, 16 years. That's just a long, long time. And Northerners were sick of it. They were exhausted. If we had been paying taxes on Iraq and Afghanistan, they wouldn't have lasted for 18, 19, 20 years. We would have ended them way sooner. But we didn't pay any taxes on them. Those completely went on the credit card. So that's why people weren't exhausted. So those are the four general reasons. Southern states, they started to redeem themselves. By redeeming themselves, it means Southern Democrats retook control of the state governments. And again, all they had to do was wait till the next election. Once the General Amnesty Act passed, they were able to vote themselves back into office. And one state after another started voting themselves back into office. By 1876, the election of 1876, there were only 3 states that had not been redeemed, that Southern Democrats had not regained control: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. So there's only 3 states in 1876 that had not been redeemed, And that is important because in the election of 1876, they will be crucial. The election of 1876 was Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, versus, sorry, it's covered. His name's Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden is a Northern Democrat, and he was known for fighting corruption. So Democrats, obviously, Northerners generally don't like him, but Samuel Tilden, he is known for fighting corruption. When the votes were cast, Samuel Tilden, he won the popular vote. Now, as you well know, from the last several years, the popular vote does not decide who the president is. It is the Electoral College that does. And in the Electoral College, there was, the Electoral College was 184 for Tilden, the Democrat, and 165 for Hayes, the Republican. You had to have 185 to win. So 184 for Tilden. He only needs one more. 165 for Hayes. He needs 20 more. The 20 disputed electoral votes were from those three states that I told you had not been redeemed: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. This got to be very, very serious. So there are three states that will decide. They're controlled by Republicans, but only because Democrats have not been able to redeem the states yet. And it's a very long, complicated story, but it went to Congress. Congress was going to decide what was going to happen, and things got to be very dangerous. Southerners and Democrats, they got to the point where they said, we are going to go to war again over this. And they were understandably pissed. The Republicans, and it was very clear Republicans had cheated. In order to avoid a war, a compromise was worked out. It's called the Compromise of 1877. This will end Reconstruction officially. It said a lot of things, but one of the main things was Republicans said, all right, you let our guy win, we will remove all the soldiers from the South. So, Compromise of 1877 will lead to Rutherford B. Hayes becoming the President of the United States, the Republican, who obviously lost. He becomes president, and this officially ends Reconstruction. So, how do you summarize Reconstruction? Well, it was a failure, and a failure for absolutely everyone. It was a failure for blacks. In terms of race relations, Southern blacks, they got the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment. They will go through a few years where they will get to the right to vote. But when Jim Crow starts being passed, we'll get to that later, they will get that right taken away. But having those amendments on the books, it is what will eventually secure their right to vote and lead to the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, which we will talk about much later. So, but in terms of race relations, it was an unmitigated failure for blacks. They got a taste of what it's like to have equal rights and voting rights, but those will be taken away. Second, economic. The South will be an utter disaster, and it will be an utter disaster for decades. We will talk about this more, but by the 1930s, it is still a disaster. Make sure you know what tenant farming, sharecropping, and the crop lien system is. Read about that in your textbook. But the South is an economic disaster for a long time to come. And the third summary is political. And this is where Northerners say that the whole thing was a failure. They failed to create a government that would be at all friendly to the North, that would look like the North in any way, shape, or form. The South will become the South was already the solid South, and it will continue to be the solid South. The solid South will remain politically and solidly Democrat for years to come, until we get to the 1960s. And there are a few exceptions, and I will tell you about the exceptions in a few elections, but the South remains solidly one party in the 1960s, and then around the 1980s, South becomes pretty solidly Republican. So it's not as solid as it used to be, but politically, it is a complete failure for the North. So, yeah, the South, the Reconstruction, failure from all sides.